from molasses water that barely passed for a drink to cracked corn that powered endless days of labor, and roasted green corn that brought rare moments of joy amid despair. These were the humble, ingenious meals enslaved people relied on to endure life on the plantations. Molasses water. At the bottom of our ranking cites molasses water, a simple mixture of molasses and water that served as a sweet ration drink. This beverage represented one of the few sources of sweetness available to enslaved people, created from the byproduct of sugar production. The irony is stark. Enslaved people labored in sugar fields, yet rarely tasted refined sugar itself, making do with the thick, dark syrup left behind. Culturally, this drink symbolized the economic exploitation inherent in plantation systems, where even waste products were rationed out as rewards. On the positive side, molasses provided quick calories and energy for grueling labor, and some users note it was mixed with herbs to treat coughs and ailments. However, the negatives are overwhelming. It was essentially flavored water, offering minimal nutrition beyond simple sugars, and its sweetness served as a tool of control, a small pleasure doled out to maintain compliance. The verdict? Molasses water ranks last because while it offered momentary relief and a rare taste of sweetness, it represents the bare minimum of sustenance, a reminder that even comfort was rationed and controlled. But if watered-down sweetness seems insufficient, our next entry shows what happened when enslaved people received literal fragments of the cash crop they cultivated. Broken rice porridge. Moving up slightly, we have broken rice porridge, also called Carolina middlings. This dish consisted of the broken, rejected bits of rice that couldn't be sold at market, boiled into a thin gruel. The Carolinas built their wealth on rice cultivation, and enslaved Africans brought with them sophisticated knowledge of rice farming from West Africa, making their labor indispensable. Yet they received only the scraps, the fragments deemed unworthy of sale. This porridge connected to African kanji traditions, a way of making grain stretch further through extensive boiling. Users describe it as sustaining but unremarkable, a survival food that filled bellies without providing much pleasure. The positives are limited. It was filling, could be stretched into soups, and provided basic carbohydrates for energy. The negatives dominate: nutritionally incomplete, bland, and a constant reminder of being valued less than the crop they cultivated. The verdict? Broken rice porridge ranks here because it represents pure sustenance without dignity, fuel for labor rather than nourishment for humans, a thin connection to homeland traditions filtered through deprivation. While broken rice came from a single crop's waste, our next item reveals how corn dominated plantation rations in its most basic form. Cracked corn grits. Plain cracked corn grits occupy this position, a staple porridge that became foundational to Southern cooking. These were simply corn kernels cracked into coarse bits and boiled into a thick, plain mush. Grits emerged from a fusion of Native American corn preparation techniques and African cooking methods, adapted by enslaved people into a daily fuel source. Users note this was day-after-day survival food, eaten plain without the butter, cheese, or shrimp that characterize modern preparations. The positives include its role as a reliable carbohydrate source that could be prepared quickly, and its eventual evolution into a celebrated Southern dish. However, when eaten plain repeatedly, grits were monotonous, nutritionally incomplete without protein or fat, and represented the bare minimum rations owners provided. The texture was often gritty and unpleasant without additions. The verdict? Cracked corn grits rank at 23 because while they became culturally significant and provided essential calories, in their original plain form they were simply bearable fuel, a foundation that required freedom and resources to transform into something worth celebrating. Cracked corn was one version of the corn monotony, but our next entry shows an even more basic preparation that Frederick Douglass himself documented. Boiled cornmeal mush. Boiled cornmeal mush sits just above plain grits, another corn-based porridge, but made from finer meal. Frederick Douglass himself wrote about receiving coarse cornmeal boiled as a primary food, calling it mush. This dish was ubiquitous across plantations, a basic porridge sometimes fried into cakes when leftovers solidified. The cultural significance is profound. Corn was cheap, stored well, and required minimal preparation, making it the economic choice for feeding enslaved populations. Users consistently describe it as bland, requiring sugar or molasses to become remotely palatable. The positives are few. It was hot, filling, and leftover mush could be sliced and fried for texture variation. The negatives are substantial, nutritionally deficient in proteins and fats, monotonous when eaten daily, and a symbol of the cheapest possible sustenance. The grainy texture and lack of flavor made it barely tolerable. The verdict: boiled cornmeal mush ranks at 22 because it represents institutional survival feeding, a step above animal feed but not by much, memorable primarily for its connection to documented slave narratives that expose the reality of plantation rations. Stewed cabbage cores. Stewed cabbage cores demonstrate the no-waste mentality forced upon enslaved people. These were the tough, woody centers of cabbages that most would discard, boiled until soft enough to eat. This practice emerged from desperation. When given limited vegetables, every part had to be consumed. Users note this exemplifies whole vegetable utilization that modern sustainability advocates celebrate, though it originated from necessity rather than choice. The cultural context reveals the ingenuity required to survive on scraps, while the edible outer cabbage leaves might have gone elsewhere. The positives include fiber content and the ability to fill cooking pots when nothing else was available. However, the negatives are clear. Cabbage cores are naturally tough and bitter, requiring extensive cooking. They provided minimal nutrition compared to the leafy parts, and they symbolize receiving literal garbage while others ate better cuts. The verdict: stewed cabbage cores rank at 21 because while they show resourcefulness and eventually influenced soul food's waste, not philosophy, they fundamentally represent being given what others wouldn't eat, survival through accepting scraps. Scrap bone broth. Scrap bone broth moves up our ranking, made by boiling discarded bones for hours to extract marrow and nutrients. After meat was consumed by plantation owners, enslaved people received the bones, which they simmered into thin but nourishing broths. This practice connects to traditional cooking across many cultures, where nose-to-tail eating was standard. Users note that bone broth has become trendy in modern health movements, praised for collagen and minerals. The positives are significant. Bone broth released calcium, phosphorus, and trace nutrients from marrow, could stretch other ingredients in soups, and provided warmth and comfort. The thin liquid could feed multiple people and helped fight illness. However, the negatives include the labor-intensive nature of extraction, requiring fuel and time, the thinness of the resulting broth from well-used bones, and the reality that enslaved people received bones only after all meat was stripped away. The verdict: scrap bone broth ranks at 20 because despite being literal scraps, it demonstrates sophisticated nutritional knowledge and provided genuine nourishment, a case where ingenuity transformed waste into something valuable for health. Chicory coffee. Chicory coffee, a roasted chicory root brew, served as a coffee substitute when real coffee was unavailable or unaffordable. Enslaved people roasted chicory roots, ground them, and brewed a bitter, dark liquid that mimicked coffee's ritual and warmth. This practice became embedded in New Orleans culture and continues today in café au lait traditions. Users describe it as bitter but comforting, a way to participate in a morning ritual without access to actual coffee beans. The positives include that chicory provided a sense of normalcy and routine, the roasting and brewing process offered a moment of culinary agency, and it contained inulin, a beneficial fiber. The drink was warming and could be shared communally. However, the negatives involve it being a poor substitute for actual coffee. The bitter taste required adjustment, and it represented making do without access to real goods. The verdict: chicory coffee ranks at 19 because while it's a substitute born from deprivation, it demonstrates creativity and established a lasting culinary tradition that outlived slavery, showing how forced innovation sometimes creates enduring cultural practices. Wild onion and garlic soup. Wild onion and garlic soup was a thin broth made from foraged bulbs, providing pungent warmth and serving as folk medicine. Enslaved people searched woods and fields for these sulfur-rich plants, boiling them into clear broths believed to fight illness. This represents food obtained outside plantation control, gathered independently. Users note these soups were used medicinally, particularly during winter sickness. The soup could be made without any provided ingredients. However, the negatives include the thinness of the broth providing minimal calories, the time required to forage adequate amounts, potential confusion with toxic lookalikes if knowledge wasn't passed down, and the pungent taste being overwhelming without other ingredients. The verdict? Wild onion and garlic soup ranks at 18 because despite being thin and pungent, it represents self-sufficiency and practical medicine, showing how botanical knowledge from Africa adapted to American plants for both nutrition and healing. Sassafras root tea. Sassafras root tea was an earthy brew made from sassafras tree roots, believed to have healing properties and serving as inspiration for root beer flavoring. This tea connected to both Native American and African herbal traditions, drunk for respiratory issues and general wellness. Users note its soothing qualities, but also mention modern concerns about safrole, a compound in sassafras that the FDA later banned due to potential carcinogenic properties. The positives include genuine soothing effects for coughs and colds, the pleasant earthy flavor that later influenced commercial beverages, and the comfort of a hot drink with perceived healing power. However, the negatives are substantial. The safrole content does pose health risks with regular consumption. It provided no nutritional value, and it represents making do with foraged ingredients for basic healthcare denied by owners. The verdict: sassafras root tea ranks at 17 because while it offered real comfort and medicinal benefit, modern understanding of its risks and its nature as a substitute for proper medical care prevent it from ranking higher. Parched corn. Parched corn consists of dried corn kernels toasted until crunchy, creating a portable snack similar to modern corn nuts. This preparation method made corn last longer and provided a shelf-stable energy source that could be carried to fields or eaten during brief breaks. Users compare it to trail mix, noting it's crunchy and lasts weeks without spoiling. The positives include excellent portability and storage, the toasting process creating pleasant nutty flavors, satisfying crunch providing textural variety, and pure corn offering quick carbohydrate energy. It required no utensils or preparation to eat. However, the negatives involve high cellulose content making it hard to digest, the potential for dental damage from extremely hard kernels, lack of complete nutrition from corn alone, and the dryness requiring water to consume comfortably. The verdict: parched corn ranks at 16 because while it's more interesting than plain boiled corn preparations and genuinely practical for field labor, it remains a one-note survival food that's nutritionally limited despite its convenience and decent taste. Corn provided portable fuel, but our next entry shows how preservation techniques created flavor that lasted through winter. Pickled cucumbers and peppers. Pickled cucumbers and peppers in brine represent preservation strategy and flavor preservation for winter months. Enslaved people who managed garden patches pickled harvests in saltwater vinegar brines, creating tangy relishes that cut through bland daily meals. This demonstrates sophisticated food preservation knowledge crucial for surviving lean seasons. Users praise the bright, tangy flavors that added excitement to monotonous diets and the security of stored food. The positives are significant. Fermentation and pickling preserved vitamins through winter. The acidity and crunch provided sensory variety desperately needed. Successful preservation meant food security, and pickles could be made from garden surplus without owner interference. The tangy burst elevated other foods. However, the negatives include high sodium content from brining, the need for containers and ingredients that weren't always available, and the reality that gardens themselves represented extra labor beyond forced fieldwork. The verdict: pickled cucumbers and peppers rank at 15 because they demonstrate agency and skill in food preservation, providing genuine pleasure and nutrition while showing how enslaved people created abundance and flavor from their own efforts. Green tomato chow relish. Green tomato chow relish, a spicy pickled condiment made from unripe tomatoes, represents harvest preservation and flavor creation. When tomatoes didn't ripen before frost, or when enslaved people harvested early from their gardens, they pickled the green fruit with peppers and spices into a tangy, slightly spicy relish. This dish ties to broader Southern pickling traditions. Users describe it as bright and tangy, perfect on cornbread, a preservation strategy that wasted nothing. The verdict: green tomato chow relish ranks at 14 because it shows impressive culinary transformation and provides real flavor enjoyment, rising above pure survival food into something that genuinely enhanced eating experiences despite difficult circumstances. Preserved relishes added brightness, but our next item shows how root vegetables provided starchy sustenance through simple fire. Turnip root roast. Roasted turnip root, cooked in ashes like a bread substitute, provided starchy sustenance with a sweet, earthy flavor. Turnips grew readily even in poor soil and could be harvested late into fall, making them reliable survival crops. The roasting method, burying them in fire ashes, caramelized natural sugars and created smokiness. The green tomato chow. Turnips being easy to grow in personal garden plots. Roasting requiring only fire access rather than cooking vessels. The sweet flavor from caramelization providing rare natural sweetness crunchiness and the filling nature of the starchy root. The smoky taste added depth. However, the negatives involve turnips being less nutritious than potatoes with fewer calories and vitamins, the bitter undertone when not roasted well, and the fact that they were chosen for cultivation because they required minimal resources, not because they were preferred foods. The verdict: turnip root roast ranks at 13 because despite being a substitution for better starches, proper preparation created genuine flavor and comfort, showing how cooking technique could elevate humble ingredients. While turnip roots provided starches from the ground, our next entry reveals what happened when enslaved people finally received actual meat, even if it came from unwanted parts. Boiled cow tongue. The boiled cow tongue represents scrap meat protein that has since become a delicacy in various cuisines, including modern tacos. After plantation owners consumed preferred cuts, enslaved people received organ meats and unusual parts like tongue. Boiling for hours rendered the tough muscle tender and edible. Users note this required pressure cooking or extensive boiling until tender, describing it as chewy but filling, a rare meat victory. The positives are substantial. Tongue provided complete protein with essential amino acids. The extensive cooking created tender texture when done properly. It demonstrated knowledge of utilizing every part of an animal, and receiving any meat at all was relatively uncommon and therefore valued. However, the negatives include the long cooking time requiring fuel, the initial tough texture if undercooked, the reality that it was given because it was considered undesirable by owners, and the preparation challenge making it labor-intensive. The verdict: boiled cow tongue ranks at 12 because despite being scraps, it provided valuable complete protein and with proper preparation actually tasted good, representing one of the better protein sources available and showing culinary skill in making tough cuts delicious. Turnip greens stew. Turnip greens stew, made from the bitter leaves of turnips boiled with whatever scraps were available, provided essential nutrients for endurance. Turnip greens are naturally bitter and tough, but become more palatable with long cooking, especially when combined with pork fat. Users note grandmothers making this stew with pork fat for warmth in winter, though enslaved people boiled them soft with minimal additions. The positives include turnip greens being rich in vitamins A, C, and K, plus calcium and iron. The greens growing abundantly and reliably, long cooking breaking down bitterness somewhat, and the stew providing hot filling nourishment. The addition of any fat dramatically improved flavor. However, the negatives involve the pronounced bitterness requiring strong tolerance, tough leaves being hard to chew if undercooked, minimal calories from greens alone without adequate protein or fat, and the reality that greens were eaten primarily because they were filling rather than desirable. The verdict: turnip green stew ranks at 11 because despite the challenging bitterness, it provided crucial micronutrients often lacking in plantation rations, and proper preparation with fat created something genuinely nourishing that evolved into beloved soul food. Turnip greens needed fat to shine, and our next entry shows exactly what fatty scraps achieved that transformation. Salt pork scraps. Salt pork scraps, consisting of undesirable fatty pieces fried or boiled, became a cornerstone of soul food and Southern cuisine. These were the fatty bits, skin, and undesirable portions remaining after better cuts were taken, heavily salted for preservation. Enslaved people used these scraps to season greens, beans, and stews, transforming bland foods. Users note scraps turned to feasts when used properly to season greens, describing the cheap, smoky legacy that continues in collard greens today. The positives are significant. Salt pork provided essential fats and calories needed for intensive labor. The smoky, salty flavor transformed bland vegetables dramatically. Fat-soluble vitamins in greens required fat for absorption, and the scraps demonstrated how undesirable ingredients became celebrated flavoring agents. However, the negatives include high sodium and saturated fat content, the scraps being chosen because owners didn't want them, the heavy salting being preservation necessity rather than choice, and health impacts from regular consumption of preserved fatty meat. The verdict: salt pork scraps rank at 10 because while literally unwanted scraps, they became transformative flavor agents that genuinely improved other foods and established lasting culinary traditions, showing how seasoning knowledge created something valuable from refuse. Salt pork transformed cultivated vegetables, but our next item reveals how wild weeds provided exceptional nutrition. Dandelion greens. Dandelion greens boiled until soft represent foraged wild nutrition that modern culture now celebrates as a superfood. These common weeds grow prolifically and contain exceptional levels of vitamins A, C, and K, plus iron and calcium. Users describe grandmothers making salads with bacon dressing, noting they're not bitter if harvested young, and emphasizing their role as survival medicine packed with iron. The cultural context involves recognizing nutritional value in plants others dismissed as weeds. The positives are impressive. Dandelions required no cultivation and grew everywhere, provided exceptional micronutrient density, especially iron for anemia prevention. Young leaves were genuinely tasty with mild bitterness. They were entirely free and outside plantation control, and they offered genuine medicinal benefits. However, the negatives include mature leaves becoming extremely bitter, potential for misidentification if botanical knowledge wasn't transferred, the need to gather large quantities for adequate calories, and no protein or fat content. The verdict: dandelion greens rank at 9 because they represent autonomous nutrition with genuine superfood qualities, and modern recognition of their value validates the botanical knowledge enslaved people maintained, transforming weeds into vital nourishment. Foraged black walnuts. Foraged black walnuts offered protein-rich nutrition from the wild, though extracting them required significant effort. Black walnut trees grow throughout eastern forests, and enslaved people gathered fallen nuts in autumn, cracking the notoriously tough shells to access rich kernels. Users note they're worth cracking for the protein boost, chopped into porridges for substance. The positives are substantial. Black walnuts provide complete protein plus healthy fats and calories. The nuts stored well through winter, providing food security. They were entirely foraged outside plantation economy. The rich flavor enhanced bland porridges and stews, and successful foraging represented skill and knowledge. However, the negatives include the extremely hard shells requiring tools and strength to crack, the staining husks that blackened hands, time investment in gathering and processing adequate amounts, potential for moldy nuts causing illness, and high effort to yield ratio. The verdict: foraged black walnuts rank at 8 because despite the labor involved, they provided crucial complete protein and fats that were otherwise scarce in plantation diets, representing valuable wild nutrition that required knowledge and effort but delivered genuine sustenance. Black walnuts provided protein from the forest, but our next entry shows how combining garden harvest with foraged greens created balanced nutrition. Pumpkin and wild greens pottage. Pumpkin and wild greens pottage combined garden-grown pumpkins with foraged greens into a hearty stew, demonstrating ingredient pairing wisdom. The sweet pumpkin balanced bitter wild greens while both contributed nutrients. Users describe this as survival alchemy, where sweet pumpkin softens bitter greens, comparing it to modern fall soups. The cultural significance lies in African stew traditions adapting to available American ingredients. The positives are considerable. Pumpkins provided vitamin A, fiber, and natural sweetness. Wild greens contributed minerals and vitamins. The combination created balanced flavors. Neither ingredient achieved alone. The thick stew was filling and warming, and it demonstrated sophisticated flavor balancing. However, the negatives include both ingredients requiring gathering or cultivation labor beyond fieldwork, seasonal limitation to fall harvest, the need for cooking vessels and extended cooking time, and the reality that pumpkins often grew in patches that owners might claim. The verdict? Pumpkin and wild greens pottage ranks at 7 because it represents genuine culinary skill in combining ingredients for both nutrition and flavor, creating something that was actually enjoyable to eat rather than merely tolerable, showing how African cooking knowledge adapted to new ingredients successfully. Roasted pumpkin seeds. Roasted pumpkin seeds transformed waste into a nutrient-dense, crunchy snack that modern culture recognizes as healthy. After using pumpkin flesh, enslaved people dried and roasted the seeds with salt when available, creating a protein and mineral-rich treat. Users celebrate these as crunchy with salt, a superfood now, noting kids loved handfuls for comfort. The positives are impressive. Pumpkin seeds provide protein, zinc, magnesium, and iron. Roasting created satisfying crunch and nutty flavor. They represented zero-waste utilization, required minimal preparation, were portable for field snacks, and offered rare pleasure through texture and taste. Seeds stored well too. However, the negatives include the small yield from each pumpkin requiring multiple pumpkins for adequate amounts, the dependence on having salt for flavor enhancement, the time needed for drying and roasting, and the seeds providing satisfaction but limited calories for energy needs. The verdict: Roasted pumpkin seeds rank at 6 because they represent smart nutrition from waste products, provided genuine enjoyment, and demonstrate how attention to detail created valuable nutrition from what others discarded. Plus, they've achieved modern superfood status, validating their nutritional value. Seeds offered crunchy satisfaction, but our next entry connects directly to African heritage through a distinctive vegetable. Okra and corn mash. Okra and corn mash represents a direct connection to African homeland through a thick, hearty dish that became a gumbo precursor. Okra came from Africa on slave ships, deliberately packed as a food source, making it a living link to heritage. Combined with corn and boiled thick with pork when available, it created filling sustenance. Users note it's slimy but filling, describing cultural memory in every bowl. Boiled thick with pork, if lucky. The positives are substantial. Okra provided fiber, vitamin C, and folate, while corn added carbohydrates. The mucilaginous texture thickened the dish, naturally creating satisfying body. It connected directly to African cooking traditions, providing cultural continuity. The combination was genuinely filling, and it evolved into celebrated gumbo. However, the negatives include the slimy texture being off-putting to many, okra requiring fresh harvest limiting year-round availability, the dish being bland without adequate seasoning or meat, and the painful irony that okra's presence in America resulted from the slave trade itself. The verdict: okra and corn mash ranks at 5 because despite texture challenges, it provided real cultural connection and nutrition, evolving into an important Southern dish while maintaining direct links to African culinary heritage. Okra traveled from Africa, but our next item shows another African seed that became deeply symbolic. Cowpea stew. Cowpea stew, made with black-eyed peas brought from Africa, provided essential protein and became a symbol of cultural survival and tradition. These African-origin beans came on slave ships as a food source and became central to soul food, evolving into hop and john eaten for luck on New Year's Day. Users note they were brought on slave ships as food and became tradition, describing simple boiling with salt that tied to home. The positives are powerful. Black-eyed peas provide complete protein when combined with corn. They connected directly to African foodways, maintaining cultural memory. The beans grew reliably in southern climates. They stored well-dried for year-round use. Simple preparation created filling, nutritious meals, and they became symbols of resilience through traditions like hop and john. However, the negatives include dried beans requiring long cooking times and fuel, plain preparations being bland without seasoning or meat, the traumatic origin story of arriving on slave ships, and incomplete protein without grain pairing. The verdict: cowpea stew ranks at 4 because it provided crucial protein while maintaining profound cultural connections, evolving into beloved traditions that celebrate survival and African heritage, making it both nutritionally and symbolically important. Black-eyed peas offered protein and cultural memory, but our next foraged item provided something rarely available: natural sweetness. Foraged persimmons. Foraged persimmons represent rare natural sweetness and freedom through food obtained entirely outside plantation control. These wild fruits, harvested after frost when sweetness peaks, provided precious sugar and vitamins while symbolizing autonomous foraging. Users note they pucker if unripe, but mash into pulp when ready, describing them as freedom food outside plantation control. The cultural significance lies in knowledge of when and how to harvest for optimal ripeness. The positives are exceptional. Persimmons provided rare natural sweetness in an otherwise bland diet. They contained vitamins A and C crucial for health. Ripeness knowledge demonstrated botanical expertise. They were entirely free from plantation economy, representing true autonomy. The fruit could be eaten raw or mashed into pulp, and successful foraging brought genuine pleasure. However, the negatives include unripe persimmons being intensely astringent and inedible, the narrow harvest window after frost, competition with wildlife for the fruit, location knowledge being required to find trees, and limited quantities from wild sources. The verdict: foraged persimmons rank at 3 because they represented rare natural sweetness and genuine pleasure in a diet devoid of both, while symbolizing food autonomy and botanical knowledge, providing not just nutrition but hope and connection to the natural world beyond plantation boundaries. Persimmons offered seasonal sweetness, but our next item provided abundant fruit that symbolized true independence. Wild muscadine grapes. Wild muscadine grapes offered abundant, accessible fruit that represented independence and seasonal celebration. These native grapes grew on wild vines throughout the South, producing thick-skinned, tart purple fruit that enslaved people gathered freely. Users describe staining hands purple, making syrup for lean months, emphasizing independence from owners. The positives are remarkable. Muscadines provided vitamin C and antioxidants. They grew abundantly without cultivation, requiring no labor investment. The harvest was entirely independent of plantation control. The fruit could be eaten fresh or preserved into syrups, extending availability. The tart flavor provided sensory excitement. Successful foraging brought community gathering opportunities, and the purple staining became a badge of autonomous work. However, the negatives include the thick, tough skins being hard to eat, the tart flavor being challenging without sweetening, the seasonal limitation to late summer and fall, seeds being large and bitter, and the messy nature of processing. The verdict? Wild muscadine grapes rank at 2 because they represent abundant natural provision and true food autonomy, offering genuine pleasure and nutrition while symbolizing independence. Plus, the ability to preserve them into syrup provided security for harder months ahead. Now, grapes brought abundant wild sweetness. But our final entry reveals the simplest preparation that created the most joy. Roasted green corn in husk. At the top of our ranking sits roasted green corn in husk, representing a moment of genuine joy amid hardship. This simple preparation involved tossing fresh young corn, still in its protective husk, directly onto fire coals. The husk steamed the kernels inside while adding subtle smoky sweetness. Users describe tossing on coals as joy amid hardship, gnawing to the cob with satisfaction. The positives are overwhelming. Fresh green corn provided natural sweetness that genuinely tasted good. The preparation was incredibly simple, requiring only fire. It could be done quickly during brief field breaks. The husks protected the corn during roasting, creating perfect steaming. The smoky sweet flavor elevated the eating experience beyond mere sustenance. It represented peak season abundance, and gnawing fresh corn provided textural satisfaction and visceral pleasure. The corn provided carbohydrates plus some vitamins when fresh. However, the minimal negatives include seasonal limitation to fresh corn harvest, the need for fire access, and still limited protein and fat content. The verdict? Roasted green corn in husk claims the #1 position because it represents the rare intersection of good nutrition, genuine pleasure, simple preparation, and moments of joy. It transcended survival food to become something people actually wanted to eat, not just tolerated, offering brief respite through natural sweetness and the primitive satisfaction of fire-roasted food, proving that even within systematic oppression, simple pleasures remain possible and precious. That wraps up this video. For more interesting videos like this, check out the cards on your screen.